All right, I just pushed record. Hello, everyone. It's 1:08 as we're getting started. I'm so excited for this next chapter for the Lunar Herbal Alchemy Guild. Happy new moon. Uh, it's June 17th as we're gathered. And I know there's a few of you who couldn't make it live. There's a couple of you guys who are relatively new to join. And so I wanted to share really quickly the background for the idea here with the elixirs. I'm going to send you a intro video. You already have it in your course materials about Blessed Thistle. We're going to incorporate that with the elixirs, but I'm going to be offering in the future a little course, a mini course as part of a larger framework for the farm up here, and using the herbs in the farm is part of what we're going to be doing. So the herbal elixirs is going to be part of a future course offering, but you guys as the Lunar Herbal Alchemy Guild are going to get to co-create it with me, which I'm super excited about. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the share. And if you happen to watch this later as a part of a course, you can know that this was created by people who have supported the nonprofit and or co-created. They're going to be giving me feedback as to what types of elixirs we're going to be making and suggestions. So part one, and today's June 17th, the new moon is in Gemini, as I mentioned. And so here we are with the first elixir workshop. So let's get started with what an elixir is. It's a term that's thrown around and kind of used to charge a lot of money for fancy bottles in health food stores sometimes. But we're going to do some nomenclature and definitions for start. So first, I just wanted to kind of share to me what an elixir is. They tend to be sweet because they often use honey. They tend to feel like very kind of potent things. Sweet, rich, and strong is the way they come out of the bottle, but they're concentrated. So you use them in little bits with teas or other things. They're really wonderful as herbal medicine, and they're one of my favorite preparations. The general preparation is if you're making a tincture. A tincture would be 40 proof alcohol, and we'll get into some of the ins and outs of this, with herbs in a bottle steeped over time. You can make and then an herbal infusion with honey. So you could, for example, add lavender to honey and take the lavender out, and you've got lavender honey, and then you could have a lemon balm tincture, and you can combine those two. Combining the honey and the alcohol is the typical definition of an elixir. Compare that to what, if you've heard me talk about an oxymel. An oxymel is an herbal honey with vinegar, and that's a very different thing. Elixirs tend to be used for drinks, and they tend to be sold as tasty drinks. And as you can tell, these drinks can have a varying amount of alcohol in them, depending on whether you're taking 2 drops of it or whether you're using it more as a celebratory drink. The nice thing about adding alcohol to the honey is it does a really good job. Those two together do a really good job at preserving whatever it is that you've made. So these, if you store them in a jar in a dark cupboard, they can last for years and years and years and years. Mine don't, because I use them for medicinal purposes. I also use them for entertaining. So let's get some wider version of what an elixir is, though. I mentioned the common kind of definition is alcohol, honey, herbs. For people who don't like to use alcohol or who have an alcohol allergy, I will be offering how to do this without alcohol, because there are many, many ways that you can make elixirs. We're not going to get into that here because it is its own little offshoot in and of itself. So you could also use vegetable glycerin is one of the most common ways to take an extraction that would be taken with alcohol. You can use vegetable glycerin. And then, instead of honey, you could use agave. You could use some other type of sweetener. In the less healthy elixirs that you find in the store, they use sugar water. And some of those recipes you find online will do that. I'm going to suggest honey or something natural, because it's just going to be more robustly better for you. So they can be ingested for their health benefits. They've been used. This is a practice that goes back centuries, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's part of food preservation. It's part of herbal medicine. The other ways that you could do it, so I mentioned the folk method is alcohol and honey. You could also preserve with apple cider vinegar. Yeah, so let's put this next to what a tincture would be. So tinctures are simply alcohol that is used to preserve an herb. The alcohol is typically 40 proof. I tend to prefer just, a nice mid-grade vodka, but you can also get higher proof moonshine or Everclear people like to use. I find that you could use other alcohol, but the taste of the brandy kind of gets in the way of tasting the herb. So vodka's pretty clear, but that's what I typically have on hand. If I happen to be gifted some kind of a higher proof, there is a store in Oregon that makes really wonderful organic high proof alcohol specifically for tincture purposes. It's not cheap. So yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm going to be offering another little offshoot of this of how to make a tincture, how to make preserve these, or the way how to preserve herbs as you would usually use alcohol without the alcohol. We're not going to be talking about that right now. Cordial. So cordials is the other thing that might be confused with an elixir, and these are ones that are alcohols that are more sold and used for pleasure and flavor versus for medicinal purposes. Saint Germain, if you've ever heard of the alcohol Saint Germain, it's an elderflower liqueur. I love making elderflower liqueur. Elderflower also happens to have a bunch of medicinal uses, but if I'm having some kind of a spring party and I want to make a fun drink, I will use elderflower liqueur with some sort of an herbal tea. The cordial is really mostly like a sipping drink, and it's known to be tastier. But cordial could also, in my experience, could overlap with elixir. An elixir and a cordial could be the same thing. Cordials, when you hear them, that word, it tends to mean you might find it at a restaurant or a dinner party. If you hear the word elixir, you could find it at a health food store. You could find it at a dinner party. If you hear the word tincture, you're talking of straight medicine. So let's go ahead and get to what we're going to be doing in the backdrop here, which is what I love. This is a little card that I was gifted. I took a picture of it. I befriended a biodynamic. There's a couple from New York City that owns a biodynamic winery up here, and we were talking about, because we are a regenerative organic farm. We were talking about the differences between regenerative farming. Regenerative and organic are kind of the same thing. Biodynamic really just means that you're applying the regenerative and organic practices to the entirety of the farm, even if you aren't selling eggs from your chickens. Everything on the acreage of your farm needs to be regenerative and biodynamic. So I would consider us biodynamic. I like the biodynamic body of work. Well, the permaculture body of work as well. They embrace the lunar cycle. They aren't necessarily pagans or Wiccans, but the Farmer's Almanac, if you go pick up a copy, will tell you about planting with the lunar cycle. So ancient cultures have known that plants live by the sun and the moon. They understand the cycles of the moon and the sun more than we do. They listen to it. They literally, that the sun is in the water and the root and the earth are the lifeblood. So it makes sense that the lunar cycles would dictate the planting of seeds in many ancient cultures. And we're going to be getting into that a little bit up here at the nonprofit with the Native Heritage Seed Garden, because the natives did have some practices around that. That doesn't necessarily inform our elixir course. Suffice to say that lunar cycles dictate the types of plants that you would plant, and they also dictate what you're going to do as you're harvesting or farming. So, for example, in a waxing moon, we're at a new moon today. The new moon is going to be waxing, building, growing until the full moon. So this is when the light increases, the sap flow is drawn up because the light is coming in. Most suitable time for planting and transplanting flowering annuals, biennials, grains, and melons. Basically, any short-lived plant that we want to harvest, its leaves, its seeds, its flowers, or its fruits. It's also a good time to apply liquid fertilizers. You can prune and you can graft, because the increased sap flow produces new growth in the tree. The tree can heal because of the sap flow, which is, I love it. Science merges with nature. I have done some grafting during the waxing moon for some trees up here, and it's worked really well. Waning moon is from the full moon to the new moon. So it's a time when the light is decreasing, sap flow is drawn down. So this focuses the energy of the plant to the roots, more suitable to root crops, to perennials, to plants that live more than 2 years. It's also a good time for applying solid fertilizers, for pruning dormant plants, as well as for harvesting, because there's less likelihood of things rotting during this time. That's my overview. Let's look at what the permaculture folks tend to say. You can divide it, and they do, and you should, into, instead of just waxing and waning, there can actually be quarterly moon cycles, as there are. So the new moon phase would be the new moon to the first quarter, from today till next weekend. This is when you're going to sow and plant leafy annuals, like I mentioned. And this is where we value or eat the plants that we're going to want to eat the leaves or the stems. So lettuce, spinach, cabbage, celery are all really good to be planted or transplanted. This is when you work with the energy of those plants. They like this energy. So whenever you're going to be doing anything with the plant, you're going to want to have it be at a time when that plant is the most vibrant. So these plants are the most vibrant during this phase. The next phase is called the first quarter phase. So that is it's week 2 of a 4-week phase. Essentially, if you think about a lunar cycle is 4 weeks. So this is right up until the full moon. So this is most suited for fruiting annuals. This is not fruit trees, but this is an annual where we value and eat the fruit or the seed-bearing part of the plants. So examples are tomatoes, peppers, pumpkins, broccoli, eggplant, beans. Those are all those foods. We don't eat the leaves of the tomato plant, we eat the seeds. So back up for the herbal access part of this, the new moon phase is where we do a lot of the work with the herbs that we use, because a lot of the herbs that we use if you think about the herbs that you get from the Lunar Herbal Alchemy Guild, a lot of them are the aerial parts. The aerial parts are the leaves and the stems. That being said, we also use the roots sometimes. So let's keep going. The full moon phase, it's the 3rd week from the full moon as she's starting to wane, but that's the week number 3. So this is most suited for working with the root crops, as well as sort of fruiting or decorative perennials. So those would be apples, potatoes, any kind of ginger, turmeric, gotu kola, or some of the herbs that you might get in the future. Asparagus and rhubarb are also root plants. We've got horseradish that we work with during this time. It's also a good time for taking cuttings and dividing plants. So cuttings are a way to propagate your plants. So the last quarter phase is it's the last week. You really don't want to work too much with moving the plants, because this is when the light is the least from the moon. So you're really just trying to improve the soil. Weeding, mulching, compost, manure teas are things that you'd be doing. So most of what we do for the Lunar Herbal Alchemy Guild, now that you kind of know the way I like to work, I'm doing a lot of stuff during the first week of the lunar cycle and the 3rd week of the lunar cycle, because we're working with the aerial parts and the root parts of the plant, mostly. Sometimes we have the flowers, like chamomile as a flower. So let's get to the specifics of the energy and the herbs of this new moon. There's also a body of work and knowledge that I will be rolling out that talks about which plants are most suited for which astrological energy. A lot of this work is centered around, if your sun sign is this is your plant that works. I tend to think that, just looking at your sun sign is like looking at 1/100th of what your astrology chart actually says. It can say a lot about you, but there's so much more. So we're going to look at, just in general, the energy of plants that are in harmony with Gemini energy. And Gemini energy is pretty strong during a new moon, because by default you have 2 celestial bodies that are conjunct. They're pretty important, the sun and the moon. If you listen to my podcast about this particular new moon, we also have goddess Juno that's in Gemini. So we have an awful lot of Gemini energy during this new moon. Gemini ruled by Mercury. It's an air sign. It's typically thought that this energy, this air sign, rules the lungs, the shoulders, the arms, and the hands. That's a whole other body of medical astrology that I'm not really qualified to go into. But the plants that Gemini is usually simpatico with, they feature super finely divided leaves or stems. things that look like lungs. So this is where it's neat. How the plant looks can actually start to tell you what the plant does. They might also have hairy or fuzzy leaves. This is related to the cilia in the lungs, or they might have some kind of a subtle odor. And the great thing is plants associated with Gemini typically are working with the respiratory system often. They're helping to relax the nervous system. They're helping to improve the respiratory system. In the body of work of astrology, they don't just work with herbs. They'll recommend flowers and fruits. So I'm just going to share this as fun information. Endive, carrots, parsnips, and oats are known to be really good with Gemini energy. Flowers, the orchid, chrysanthemum, lilac, azalea, daffodil, lily of the valley, honeysuckle are all good with Gemini energy. Meaning they embody the beauty and the power of the Gemini energy. So since we're in so much Gemini energy right now, it's nice to have some support with helping our physical systems and our energetic systems understand this. So here we get to the herbs. Mullein. Mullein, super fuzzy. If you ever look at mullein before it's picked, it looks like you could just pet it. Hyssop, also. Lemon balm. Lemon balm is kind of related to blessed thistle. They're not necessarily finely divided leaves or stems, but they do have a little bit of some pokey, hairy stuff on them. Lobelia elecampane. Elecampane is slightly fuzzy. Vervain, woodbine, yarrow. I have some yarrow right behind me here. Yarrow is finely divided leaf-ish, but it's not as finely divided as something like dill. Dill is like the ultimate version of the bronchi of the lungs, but you can also find metal sweet, fennel, looks a lot like dill, skullcap, lavender, fenugreek, licorice, valerian, and blessed thistle. So if you have a chance to look at the video in the introduction where I talk about what blessed thistle does, blessed thistle is really good for working with the respiratory system. So it makes sense. It's one of many things that blessed thistle does, but it makes sense that blessed thistle will be at this time. So this is actually one of the ways that I choose the herbs for the Lunar Herbal ALchemy Guild when I have the wherewithal to do it. So this is what we're going to be working with for this first elixir gathering. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing recipes. I'm going to move next and just simply to giving you a basic herbal elixir recipe. And then when we go to the second and third cycles of this, we'll get into the nuances of making medicine, making things tasty, what some recipes might be for different themes. But for right now, I just want the overarching thing to be, oh, I think I know what an elixir is now. And oh, I think I could understand how if I'm working with Lunar Herbal ALchemy, I could look at what the moon's doing and what the astrology is, and I could use that to inform some of what I'm going to be doing if I'm making an elixir or a cordial that's not simply for treating a cold or treating rheumatoid arthritis or something like that. So you're going to basically use a pint jar. You're going to use some kind of canning jar if you can. I like to use pint jars because they're just the right size, especially if you're first starting to do your medicine making. I would recommend making a small to medium sized batch of it and see how it actually tastes and works with you. This can be strong medicine sometimes, so you're going to want to make sure you like the way it works and you like the way it tastes. So you're kind of going to work you're gonna pour a third pint of honey over the herbs. You're gonna cover, what you're essentially gonna do is make sure you cover the herbs all the way. So I would actually encourage you to say, you could even work in thirds, especially if the herbs are fresh. If they're dried, you could say, instead of having a third of the jar be herbs, a third of the jar be honey, and a third of the jar be alcohol, you would have a fifth of the jar be herbs or something like that, or a sixth of the jar be herbs, and then equal parts. Essentially, it's going to be equal parts honey and alcohol. And then if you have fresh herbs, there's going to be a lot more space taken up by fresh herbs because they've got water in them. You've got dried herbs. You're going to use about a third or a quarter of the amount of herbs that you would otherwise use. So this is going to be much like making a tincture or a honey infusion. This is going to take some time. Depending on how potent you want it, I would say a week minimum. You could let this stuff steep for 3 months if you wanted to. Typically, I use a lunar cycle because a lunar cycle, a new moon is an excellent time to put an elixir out to or put elixir up to create it. And then the next lunar cycle, you're going to open your cupboard. If you're really going to be on your game, you're going to shake that jar full of liquid, and just to get it all moving. You don't have to, but you're going to keep it in a dark cupboard for a lunar cycle. And then after that lunar cycle, you're going to be able to open it and use it. If you really want to keep it for extra long time, refrigerate it. If not, keep it in a cool, dark place. Here I put to enjoy it 2 ounces at a time. There's a lot of room for wiggle room around that. And really it depends on what you're doing and what herbs you're using and what the medicinal potency of those herbs is. There's a big difference between an herb like chamomile and an herb like wormwood. Chamomile, you can have at it. Wormwood, you're not going to feel very good if you take too much of that. So we're going to get into the nuances of that. For this cycle, since you have blessed thistle, I would invite you to work with that herb specifically. And you could even simply put blessed thistle up in honey and alcohol. Some things that you could add to blessed thistle that might improve its taste would be chamomile, lavender a little bit, otherwise it could be a little soapy. You could also, blessed thistle works very well with calendula. I'm not going to get too much into a recipe for us here right now. I just wanted this to be an introduction. So I'm going to stop the recording for the sake of the teaching portion of this and see if anybody has any questions. I'll start the recording again if there happen to be any really potent questions. Otherwise, thank you guys so much, and I will see you